let's talk about open science and open science practices. Here, we have a set of practices that emphasizes the transparency requirement for research and its impact on scientific rigidity. So we are mostly talking about studies that contribute to fields in the rigid testing stage I talked about initially. So here, open science is the practice of making research materials, the research process, and the results maximally transparent and accessible to the public. That's the scientific public most of the time, but in principle also the general public. This is facilitated by the internet that allows you just to create repositories that make lots of content accessible to interested persons without printing it in a printed journal, basically hundreds of pages of documentation. So now open science practice is a realistic option, and there is a good number of researchers that strictly adhere to practicing open science. However, as I said, there is trade-offs between open science principles and some other ethical requirements and ethical principles. For researchers, it can mean a considerable modification of their workflow, maybe an improvement in some cases, but at least a modification, in order to ensure access and accessibility. But some practices may just prove illegal, legally contested, and problematic in terms of research ethics, data protection, and copyright issues. Okay, and there's a few distinct components in open science, which I try to summarize under open methodology, open data, open peer review, open access publishing, and open educational resources, and last but not least, pre-registration. Open methodology is mostly that you provide every information that allows others to in detail understand what you have done and how you have collected your data, and would allow a replication of the study. So you can basically do the same thing again and see if the results align with the published results. That's especially valuable in research areas where key hypotheses have been identified and are researched heavily. So that's this rigid testing stage. There, replicability is very valuable. Making studies as comparable as possible is valuable for meta-analysis. So as long as data protection and privacy issues and copyright infringements are avoided, this is certainly a beneficial thing in many contexts, or in almost all thinkable contexts. Specifically, that can be study design, survey sample specifications, descriptive statistics of sample characteristics, questionnaires, codebooks, interview guides, and so on. But also how were missing cases handled, were any data imputations done, how were the data cleaned, how were indexes and scales constructed, were they tested in any way, and why and how were certain methodological decisions made and how were they executed. Okay, and the Open Science Framework, or OSF, is an institution, a non-profit institution that kind of tries to provide a platform to implement open science principle on a larger scale. The next step, besides sharing basically your methodological information, is to share your data. So you would make research data accessible to the general public, and data analysis commands that you used to produce the results that you present in a publication. So this enhances the potential for other researchers to scrutinize your data and their quality, check how adequate the analytical procedures they are, and to try to replicate also the analysis, running the same analysis on the same data. And that should, of course, give the same result. And if not, there's something wrong. This can also have the beneficial effect that given data sets are exploited and used in much more detail and with much greater intensity, because then several research teams can use a specific set of data, as the researcher teams that collected the data in the first place often lacked the time to exploit the data they generated, and rather start with the next project, and then these data aren't fully explored to the extent that would be useful to the scientific community. However, the challenge is that researchers lose incentives to generate data themselves. The idea might be to wait for someone else to release relevant data and then do a secondary analysis, such that you don't have to spend so many resources on collecting data yourself. So on the one hand, it's good to exploit the collected data better, but it shouldn't produce a downward spiral where researchers don't collect data in the first place because they hope somebody else will do that. One thing that researchers tend to do is to define an embargo period before data are finally released, also preventing releasing incomplete or erroneous data. So only after everything has been cleaned up properly and a first round of exploitation has happened, then the data are finally released, and then is completely accessible to the research community. Okay. The next principle is open peer review, and that is much less widely adopted because there is lots of pros and cons. So the usual thing is that if you want to publish a study, it is peer reviewed by anonymous reviewers that are appointed by a journal's editor. So the editor knows who you are. They look for 2 or 3 people who have expertise in the area you are doing research in, and invites them to write an anonymous review about your study and ask for revisions or reject the whole thing. And that's how it usually works. And then you do 1, 2, or maybe 3 rounds of revisions or try somewhere else. But that is often, of course, a bit unfair if the reviewers are completely blinded or anonymous from the researchers themselves. There's of course little accountability. You could be really unfair, have hidden agendas, have conflicts of interest, particularly if it's your field of research and somebody else does something you don't like. then you probably don't disqualify it based on its quality, but because of your personal taste. Okay. So what people experiment with is that peer reviewing happens in the open, non-anonymously, and maybe after an initial publication. So first the study would be published, then people can review it. People can ask for clarifications, people can ask for revisions, and then the study is developed over time. So there's only minimal quality checks done in the beginning, and then we get an evolution of versions. A more conservative approach would be to keep the process as it is, but revealing the identities of the reviewers. Or publish the reviews. So one can check what the criticism was. So there's no agreement yet on whether this is a good or even the best practice, and how open peer review could look like in a way that makes everyone happy. Of course, no, never everyone is happy, but is it a good alternative to the regular blinded peer review process? So it can produce serious problems of its own, but maybe also solve some problems in the peer review process. So it's an ongoing discussion. The next point is open access publishing, which basically, I guess, everybody agrees is a good thing. The conventional publication model is that scientists submit their research, and then you have publishing companies that then publish the article and own the rights for this version that is released, so they can block people, or they require people to pay for accessing these articles and pay a lot of money. The usual way is that universities pay for a subscription to these journals, often in larger packages, and then people who study at these universities, or the people who work for these universities, can access these articles that this specific university has bought access to. The big problem associated with this is that universities on the one hand pay for the researchers, they do their work, and then also pay for accessing the kinds of work that the researchers have done. So they kind of pay for everything and get very little, because in the end it's very costly to buy these subscriptions, and universities will usually be selective in which of these subscriptions they buy. So that means it's bad for students and researchers because they can't access everything that the research community has created. And it's also bad for the general public because they usually don't have any access to these subscriptions. Therefore, open access publication is a good alternative where the authors or their institutions pay a relatively high fee in the beginning when an article is published, but then it is free for everyone. Everybody can access it, be they university students or journalists or general, just regular people. So this can cost up to $2,000 per article, but then kind of the long-term benefit is that everybody can access it, and you don't have to renew subscriptions all the time. And currently, like, we are in double bind where universities have to pay for the subscriptions and for the open access publication fees, because it's not so widespread open access publication as it should be, but it would certainly be a good thing. Okay. The open educational resources is something that got a lot of should I say, a lot of publicity during the coronavirus pandemic, because then educators, teachers produced more and more resources that were remotely accessible, and if those are not only accessible in a university private network, but are publicly available, that is of course nice. If the public can educate itself, you can basically get high quality lectures on a university level teaching without having to join a university and so on. So that's good, and also people may help improve the educational content as well. Some people would then say, oh, I watched a video and this wasn't really clear, can you explain it better, or can you provide more evidence? These kinds of things could be beneficial. Okay, and the very final point in the open science chapter is pre-registration. The idea here is to avoid that people report results as significant tests of a hypothesis. So you get supporting data at statistical significance for a certain hypothesis, and you score that basically as a support for an expected result for a hypothesis. However, what you actually did was snoop around in your data and see which relationships proved statistically significant, and then in hindsight say, this was my expectation. The problem there is that statistical tests are one-off tests, and if you run not one but many different tests, this and your only criterion is to pick the one that is significant. That means that these error probabilities for type 1 errors are no longer real. They don't hold any longer. They are only for one-off tests. If you do 20 tests, each of which has a 5% chance of a type 1 error, these errors cumulate, right? So if you just snoop around in your data for significant relationships and later on say this was my hypothesis to begin with, that is bad scientific practice. And to avoid that and increase the credibility of such hypothesis tests, you would create a document called the pre-registration. Before data analysis, or even better, before data collection, you would register your study, its expectation in terms of main hypotheses and its methodology and the data analysis procedures you're going to use. So this makes sure that researchers really test existing hypotheses rather than snooping around for the interesting results first and then saying, I knew it before. Because there is something to the saying that hindsight is easier than foresight. You have much more information in hindsight what really is meaningful. And if you mask that as foresight, you kind of suggest that you knew more than you actually knew, and that your result is worth more than it actually is worth. So again, this requires some changes to practical approaches that many researchers take. The ideal research process would become even more of a central thing, work from theory towards data and not first snooping around in the data and then coming up with a theory that fits. You might ask yourself why researchers are so eager sometimes to engage in data snooping. That's on the one hand a general human tendency. We just like to be right and confirm our expectations, even if this is contrary to epistemological principles. However, there is also a practical or career-centered explanation, because research that rejects hypotheses often has a disadvantage in the traditional peer review process and makes it more difficult to publish null findings, so findings that didn't support the hypothesis, despite this actually being of high academic significance in many instances. So if null findings are inherently more difficult to publish, that is often because they are more difficult to interpret, because they are contrary to the previous belief that was the foundation for the hypothesis. And also they could very well result from methodological problems or from insufficient statistical power. So reviewers will become skeptical if there is a null finding and are probably more likely to point out methodological problems like insufficient statistical power. Pre-registration, however, isn't an antidote for everything. There is clearly less incentive or less usefulness in pre-registering your research in the explorative and model building stages of research, where you usually don't have these much discussed and intensively researched hypotheses where each test counts. Data snooping is basically a completely rational part of exploratory studies and is not driven by rigid hypothesis testing. It's much more open-ended. So the role and practice of statistical hypothesis testing in relation to explorative research must then be rethought, because it's a valid point that we can't really trust the significance levels if we run so many different tests. However, since the levels of significance reported are only useful for interpretation if all hypotheses tested are reported, there is not optimal to then in your explorative research use the conventional p-values and limits. On the other hand, you need some criterion to identify findings as potentially meaningful, and by marking your results as those of an explorative study, this might be even sufficient to practically take care of this problem.